It began like a whisper in the night. Then came the roar. A swarm of more than 250 drones streaked across the sky, tearing through the Crimean darkness and locking onto a single target, the Feodosia oil refinery. In a flash, the peninsula's lifeline was gone. The explosion that followed did not just ignite fuel tanks, it ignited panic across an entire region. For the first time since the beginning of the war, Crimea, Russia's so-called fortress, was burning from within. The Feodosia refinery had been the last major fuel source for the peninsula, capable of processing 250,000 tons of oil each year. Its destruction meant more than a logistical failure, it meant suffocation. Within hours, the once steady rhythm of daily life collapsed. Streets fell silent, gas stations stood empty, and the air was filled with frustration, fear, and disbelief. According to local reports, more than half of all filling stations had completely run dry. Cars were abandoned along highways. People lined up through the night, clutching fuel cans, hoping to find a few remaining litres of gasoline. But hope quickly turned to desperation. Those who waited for hours often returned home, empty-handed, exhausted, and furious. As darkness fell again, scenes of quiet despair unfolded. Drivers siphoning gasoline from each other's cars in the shadows, whispers of bartering and theft spreading from one neighborhood to another. For the people of Crimea, the crisis had moved beyond inconvenience. It had become a battle for survival. Even the Kremlin's attempts to control the chaos only deepened the sense of collapse. In a desperate move reminiscent of the Soviet era, Moscow reinstated ration cards limiting each citizen to 20 liters of fuel. But that too proved useless. The damaged Kerch Bridge, the only direct land route to mainland Russia, could no longer support heavy tankers. Transporting fuel by sea had become almost impossible, with Ukrainian naval drones patrolling the Black Sea, like silent predators. And the railway lines feeding Crimea were under constant sabotage by resistance groups. Every path to resupply had been cut. By the early morning hours, the once bustling peninsula felt like a ghost island. Long queues of stranded vehicles stretched along the coast. Hospitals began to ration generator use. Public buses stopped running. Farmers were unable to power their tractors. It was no longer just a fuel shortage, it was the unraveling of an entire ecosystem. Russia's unbreakable bastion in the south had become trapped, isolated, and vulnerable. The psychological impact was devastating. Frustration turned to anger, and anger to fear. People began to ask the questions no one dared to voice. Had Moscow lost control of Crimea? Could this be the beginning of something far greater than a fuel crisis? What happened that night was not random. It was the final act in a meticulously planned campaign, a strategy designed not only to destroy fuel, but to break the very backbone of Russia's presence in the region. The world would soon learn that the fire in Feodosia was not an isolated explosion. It was the final domino in a long and calculated operation, an operation that would change the fate of Crimea forever. What exactly led to this moment? And how did Ukraine manage to choke off the peninsula's lifeline without firing a single conventional shot? The answer lies in the months of preparation that came before the night of fire. In the days that followed the strike, Crimea began to suffocate. What had once been the pride of Moscow's southern empire was now paralyzed, its roads eerily quiet, its gas stations boarded up, and its citizens caught in a spiral of helplessness. By dawn, desperate drivers formed endless queues stretching for kilometers, clutching empty fuel cans as if they were lifelines. They waited for hours, sometimes days, only to discover that the pumps had run dry again. Drone footage shared by local channels showed a surreal landscape, silent intersections filled with stranded cars, public buses left abandoned, and grocery shelves already thinning as deliveries stopped. Gasoline, once taken for granted, had become a new form of currency. People began to trade fuel for medicine, for food, even for favors. And for those who had none, despair grew heavier by the day. Prices skyrocketed to 80 rubles per litre, a cost unbearable for most Crimeans. The region's fragile economy collapsed overnight. Taxi drivers and delivery workers unable to afford fuel vanished from the streets. Tourists who once flocked to the peninsula's beaches found themselves stranded, trapped in a logistical nightmare. Life had ground to a halt. Inside homes, the situation was even darker. Without stable power supplies, families relied on generators machines that now stood silent without fuel to run them. Bakeries stopped baking, schools shortened their hours, and hospitals were forced to ration electricity to keep life support machines running. Every corner of civilian life was unraveling, piece by piece. The so-called administration installed by Russia in Crimea attempted to calm the public with empty statements, promising that deliveries are on the way. But few believed them. Every promise clashed with the grim reality on the ground, the Kerch Bridge still damaged railways under sabotage, and the Black Sea routes crawling with Ukrainian naval drones. Even pro-Kremlin media could no longer hide the truth the peninsula had been cut off from the mainland. Behind the scenes, the Kremlin tried to find emergency alternatives. Small ferries were secretly mobilized to transport limited amounts of fuel across the sea under cover of night. But even those missions ended in failure. Satellite images later revealed that several fuel barges were intercepted or destroyed before reaching port. The message was clear: Crimea was no longer reachable. And as the crisis deepened, the psychological toll began to outweigh even the material losses. The myth of invincibility that Crimea was Russia's untouchable fortress began to crumble. Ordinary citizens, once reassured by official propaganda, started to question everything. If Moscow cannot bring us fuel, one resident reportedly said, how can it defend us at all? That question echoed through every city and village on the peninsula. The silence of the streets became the sound of a region realizing it was alone. The chaos was not accidental. It was the product of a carefully designed campaign, one that had been building for months, layer by layer, strike by strike. Ukraine's approach had not been to storm the gates of Crimea, but to close them. And now, as the peninsula gasped for fuel, the world began to understand the brilliance and the cruelty of that strategy. Long before the night Feodosia burned, the trap had already been set. Ukraine's campaign to isolate Crimea did not begin with explosions. It began with patience, intelligence, and the slow tightening of a logistical noose. What the world saw in October was only the final act of a strategy that had been unfolding quietly for months. Kyiv's planners called it the Crimean Fuel Trap, a concept that merged military precision with economic suffocation. Rather than attacking troops directly, Ukraine targeted the arteries that fed them, the refineries, the storage depots, and the supply routes that kept the Russian occupation alive. According to satellite data from NASA's FIRM system, as early as summer, massive fires were already raging across Russian refineries in the Krasnodar region and beyond. These were not random accidents. They were the first cuts in a larger dissection. Every hit on the Russian mainland weakened the peninsula's pulse. With each refinery that went up in flames, Crimea's dependence on its own limited reserves grew. Step by step, Kyiv was drying the well before poisoning the stream. Analysts from Defense Express and Jane's Defense Weekly noted that Ukraine's long-range drones had systematically eliminated the closest and most efficient refineries supplying Crimea, including the Tuapse and Ilsky plants. What was once a vast logistical network linking the Russian heartland to the Black Sea had become a series of broken arteries. Then came the second phase, the blockade of all external routes. The symbolic and strategic center of this plan was the Kerch Bridge, Vladimir Putin's pride project, and Russia's physical claim to Crimea. Kyiv understood its importance not just as infrastructure but as propaganda. By striking it repeatedly, Ukraine achieved what no traditional offensive could fear. The bridge was still standing, but it was functionally dead. It could no longer carry heavy tankers or military trains without risk of collapse. The sea, once Russia's escape route, was no longer safe either. Ukrainian naval drones had transformed the Black Sea into a testing ground for modern asymmetric warfare. Russian warships, once dominant, now cowered in port. Merchant ships and fuel carriers were forced to pay impossible insurance premiums or abandon the route entirely. One by one, ferries and cargo lines suspended operations, citing terror threats. It was the maritime equivalent of a siege wall. The final phase targeted the railway, the last fragile thread connecting Crimea to the mainland. Ukrainian partisans and special operations units struck at bridges, signaling systems and depots, turning every journey into a gamble. Each explosion, each act of sabotage slowed the flow of fuel further until it nearly stopped altogether. By the time Feodosia was attacked, the trap had already closed. Crimea was cut off from all sides, land, sea, and rail. Its reserves were dwindling, its refineries destroyed, its bridges weakened. The entire peninsula had become a pressure chamber waiting for one final spark to ignite the collapse. That spark came on the night of October 6th, when 251 drones descended like a steel storm. It was the moment months of planning converged into a single decisive blow. October 6th, a night forever etched into Crimea's history. The sky above Feodosia was unusually quiet before the storm began. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. From the east, waves of Ukrainian UAVs appeared on radar screens, more than 250 in total, advancing in coordinated formation. What followed was not a single explosion, but a cascade of precision strikes that turned the peninsula into a landscape of fire. Witnesses described the night as a sky made of sparks. Civilian videos later leaked on Telegram showed glowing dots streaking downward one after another, followed by shockwaves that rippled through the darkness. Each impact sent towers of flame bursting hundreds of meters into the air. Secondary detonations followed the unmistakable sign that fuel storage tanks had been hit directly. The Feodosia refinery, once the last functional reserve of the region, was engulfed in a wall of fire visible from dozens of kilometers away. According to analysis by Reuters and Defense Express, this was not a random swarm but a multi-layered strike designed to completely paralyze Russian air defenses. The drones were divided into several tactical waves. The first acted as decoys, forcing Russian radar and missile batteries to reveal their positions. The second carried electronic warfare payloads to jam targeting systems. And the third, the deadliest, were armed with explosives descending on predetermined coordinates with near-perfect accuracy. By the time Russian forces reacted, the sky was already filled with chaos. Anti-aircraft batteries fired blindly into the darkness, but the sheer volume of incoming drones overwhelmed them. Communication lines between defense sectors were jammed. In less than an hour, the peninsula's last major energy hub had been reduced to ashes. It was not only fuel that burned that night, it was a symbol. The Kremlin's myth of control, of stability, of an unbreakable Crimea went up with the smoke. The blast illuminated the peninsula's coastline, reflecting off the calm waters of the Black Sea like a warning flare to Moscow itself. Within hours, panic spread. Sirens wailed across Sevastopol and Simferopol as rumors of new waves circulated. People fled to the outskirts, fearing further strikes. The puppet administration urged calm, claiming the situation is under control, but few believed them. Social media filled with videos of explosions of people running of the night sky glowing red. Satellite images released the next morning confirmed the scale of devastation, vast black scars where storage tanks once stood. Experts estimated that tens of thousands of tons of fuel were destroyed, crippling both civilian and military logistics. The loss was more than physical, it was psychological. Russia's most fortified region had been humiliated, struck at its core with surgical precision. For Ukraine, this was the culmination of months of silent preparation. For Russia, it was a rude awakening, proof that no fortress is truly impregnable when its lifelines are cut. But the full weight of this attack would not be measured in flames alone. The ripple effects were already spreading from empty gas stations to halted tank divisions. As the fires in Feodosia burned through the night, the shockwaves rippled far beyond Crimea. What had started as a regional fuel shortage was now spiraling into a nationwide crisis. For the Russian military, the loss of the peninsula's last major fuel reserve was nothing short of catastrophic. Over 60,000 troops stationed in Crimea found themselves stranded tanks, immobilized aircraft grounded, and supply convoys stuck along silent roads. Ukraine's commander-in-chief Oleksandr Syrsky called the operation Deep Strike a campaign built not on brute force but on surgical precision. By systematically cutting fuel arteries, Ukraine had transformed energy into a weapon. A tank, no matter how advanced, is nothing without diesel. A fighter jet is useless without kerosene. A warship is just floating metal without fuel. By destroying the infrastructure that powered Russia's war machine, Kyiv had done what bullets could not. It brought the entire occupation to a standstill. According to analyses by the Moscow Times and Defense News over the previous 2 months, Ukraine had targeted 85 high-value sites, 33 of them military, 52 industrial. Each strike severed a different nerve of Russia's logistical system. By late September, roughly 38% of Russia's refining capacity, equivalent to more than 300,000 tons of crude oil per day, was offline. That loss cascaded through every layer of the economy, from military supply chains to consumer markets. For the Kremlin, this was an unthinkable humiliation. The self-proclaimed energy superpower that once dictated Europe's fuel prices now faced rationing at home. Gasoline production fell by nearly 1 million tons, a 20% drop in national output. Panic buying spread from Crimea to the mainland. The Russian government was forced to do the unthinkable: ban all gasoline exports and beg its allies for emergency supplies. Shipments from Belarus, China, and even Singapore were quietly arranged, each one eroding the image of Moscow's self-reliance. This economic unraveling exposed something deeper: the decay of a system built on the illusion of endless energy dominance. The Kremlin's entire geopolitical power had rested on controlling oil and gas flows, using them as levers over both enemies and allies. Now, as Ukraine turned those very pipelines and depots into targets, the foundation of that strategy was collapsing. The domestic repercussions were immediate. Inflation surged, transport costs doubled. The Ministry of Finance floated an emergency plan to raise VAT from 20 to 22% to cover defense spending, a decision that would directly burden ordinary Russians already struggling to afford basic goods. Economists warned of a looming technical recession. Even Sberbank's CEO German Gref admitted publicly that Russia had entered a phase of stagnation. Across social media, comparisons began to surface with Kazakhstan's fuel protests of 2022 demonstrations that quickly became a revolution. The parallels were haunting. A government that could not provide mobility, energy, or stability was a government standing on thin ice. Inside the Kremlin's gilded halls, fear replaced confidence. Putin's promise of security was now a question mark, his unbreakable unity fraying under economic reality. Crimea, once paraded as proof of Russia's might, had become a mirror reflecting the fragility of a system cracking under its own weight. But was this collapse only about fuel, or was it a sign of something much larger? The smoke rising over Feodosia was more than the aftermath of an airstrike. It was the symbol of an empire in retreat. Crimea, once portrayed as Russia's shining trophy, now stood as a monument to isolation and failure. Roads that once bustled with military convoys were deserted. Gas stations that once glowed through the night were dark and silent. For the first time in a decade, the so-called jewel of the Black Sea had become a stranded island, cut off, starved and fearful. In the weeks that followed, the strike daily life on the peninsula decayed further. Hospitals ran out of fuel for their generators, bakeries closed their doors, and fishermen left their boats moored because engines could no longer start. Public transportation ceased almost entirely. Children walked to school, soldiers hitched rides on supply trucks, and long lines of civilians waited hours for a few precious liters of gasoline. Crimea had returned to a pre-industrial rhythm, not through choice, but through defeat. What made this transformation even more devastating was its quiet inevitability. Ukraine had not conquered Crimea with tanks or troops. It had used patience, intelligence, and precision. As analysts from Reuters and Deutsche Welle observed, Kiev had turned modern warfare into a lesson in strategic endurance, proving that sometimes cutting an enemy's lifelines can be more powerful than cutting its front lines. For Moscow, this was a geopolitical nightmare. The doctrine of energy-based power, the very heart of Russia's global influence, had collapsed under its own weight. By weaponizing its dependence on fuel, Ukraine had exposed a vulnerability the Kremlin never acknowledged: that power built on oil and propaganda cannot withstand strategic isolation. The once proud narrative of Crimea as an eternal part of Russia now rang hollow against the backdrop of empty fuel depots and silent refineries. On the military front, the effects were equally dire. Without fuel, the peninsula's air defense systems could not maintain full readiness. Fighter jets remained grounded. Tanks sat motionless in their hangars. Even the Black Sea Fleet, already battered by repeated Ukrainian drone strikes, faced logistical paralysis. The peninsula that was meant to project Russian strength into the Mediterranean had become a burden Moscow could barely sustain. And yet the most profound blow was psychological. For years, the Kremlin had sold the illusion that Crimea was invincible, that its annexation marked the dawn of a new Russian century. But as the lights went out across Sevastopol, that illusion died. What remained was a population trapped between fear and fatigue, aware that the world they were promised no longer existed. Ukraine's message was unmistakable: the war for Crimea would not be won by territory, but by endurance. Kyiv had replaced brute force with intelligence missiles, with drones, and fear with strategy. The siege was not only physical, it was existential. The question now echoes far beyond the Black Sea. If Russia cannot keep Crimea alive, can it truly keep the illusion of empire alive? The peninsula's silence has become an answer in itself, a quiet admission that the fortress has fallen not with a bang, but with exhaustion. So what do you think? Has Ukraine's silent siege already decided the future of Crimea? Or is Moscow preparing one final desperate gamble to reclaim control? Share your thoughts and analysis in the comments below. And if you value clear, independent reporting on this historic turning point, make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us for the next update.